I'm Joe Novak, and I'm here at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition in Pensacola, Florida. I am so appreciative of the work the people here have done to create this wonderful software called CmapTools and to help in so many ways to spread the word on the work that I have been doing for all of my life, all my professional life. So I'll tell the story here with a series of slides and some comments as I go through, starting with my early years. I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in a little one-bedroom house in northeast Minneapolis, shown here on the map toward the top, 2319 5th Street Northeast. A relatively lower class working neighborhood, a few miles from the university, which you can see the pathway to the university right down the middle there, and you also see a couple of interstate highways which weren't there until the 1960s. I grew up in the Russian Greek Catholic Orthodox Church, which was very ornate, and as a little toddler in the church with the high dome and the figures of angels up in the dome, it was just awesome to me. And I remember the feeling of being so humble and so overtaken by the grandeur of the church when I was a little guy. I also was in the Boy Scouts and got to believe that we really were here to serve the people and not just ourselves. And somewhere between the home and the church and Boy Scouts, I developed this commitment that if I could possibly do it, I wanted to do something that would be helpful to the people of the world. I don't know really the roots of that commitment. Maybe it was in part my dad, because he was always encouraging me to do new things and to do the best I can, and also giving me the confidence that I could do anything I chose to do. He often said to me, if somebody else can do it, Joe, you can do it. So I got to believe that. I went to public schools in northeast Minneapolis, which were not the best. I learned later as I traveled around the city more, because we're in a relatively poor section of Minneapolis. Edison High School, named after Thomas Edison, shown here, was where I did junior high school and high school, since the enrollments had shrunk after the Depression, and a lot of classes had been combined. And so the junior high school was combined with the high school in 1941. I spent most of my time in high school doing other things than studying, and part of my time was pressing clothes at Central Cleaners on a Hoffman press. So that was my college and high school support for 8 years. So I really owe it to Central Cleaners as my, quote, scholarship for my education. The high school was not the best either academically or in terms of physical plant, but I did have two great teachers, one an English teacher who taught us to love the ideas that you could garner from good literature and valued understanding the literature rather than memorizing facts and figures from the literature. And my physics teacher, Sam Draghi, emphasized understanding the concepts of physics, not just memorizing formulas and learning how to solve equations. So with those two exceptions, my high school was pretty much a bore and uninspiring, and my grades show it. And frankly, I don't know how I got into college, but I guess there were some redeeming features in my test scores. I graduated in 1948, full of enthusiasm to go on. Graduation was not a big deal for me. I was looking forward to going to college. The University of Minnesota was just about 3.5 miles from my house. In fact, my next door neighbor used to walk to work there. He worked on the maintenance crew at the university. And so when I started, it was an easy hitchhike down University Avenue, 2 blocks from my house, to the university on 15th Avenue in Southeast. And on the corner of the university entrance was the mathematics building. I had decided I'd major in mathematics because I found that relatively easy in high school and relatively interesting. Also, you got 1 credit for each class hour, and since I was working 35 to 40 hours a week, I had to keep my class time to a minimum. It was in my sophomore year when I was studying for the final exam in integral calculus, not using this book, of course. It dawned on me that what I had been learning in all my studies of math was the procedures to solve math problems, not the concepts of mathematics, not the understanding of the ideas in mathematics. And that was sort of a shock. And I thought, I could never be a good teacher without understanding the concepts. And I would have to go back and learn my math all over again. So rather than doing that, I decided I would switch to the sciences as my major, and I decided to concentrate on botany. In addition to taking a dozen or so botany courses, I started working with one of the professors, Albert Frankel, a tremendously kind, wise man who gave me all kinds of encouragement, even though I was continuing PhD studies in science education, not in botany. Nevertheless, I did learn as much botany as was available to me, and I found myself enjoying both teaching botany and doing research in botany, especially working along with Albert Frankel, who had hired me as a research assistant. At that time, he was working on the photosynthesis in purple bacteria, and that was one of the projects I helped with, for which he later got some international recognition. All of the psychology at Minnesota at that time was based on behavioral psychology, with most of the research being done with animals, and one of the common forms of research using a research tool called the Skinner box, developed by B.F. Skinner, who was at Minnesota at that time. One of the things my dad always emphasized, if something doesn't make sense to you, there's probably something wrong with that, or it's just plain wrong. And all that behavioral psychology I was taught, I thought was sheer nonsense when it comes to understanding human learning. So in spite of the fact that that was the only psychology available to me then, I was searching for some other theory of how people learn. The problem was that at 1948, 49, 50, the only theory around in the US was behavioral psychology. So not buying into that, I turned instead to ideas from cybernetic theory, most of it being developed by Norbert Wiener. Cybernetic theory looked upon the mind as a human information storage and processing organ that paralleled the ways in which information could be stored and processed in computers. So that was the theoretical foundation for my PhD thesis. From the 1950s through the 1960s, our research group struggled to find a better learning theory. The cybernetic ideas were interesting, but our data didn't support the notion that information processing and information storage were two independent processes. It looked more like they were very much dependent on each other. And so we were looking about for another theory of learning. We were also looking for a better theory of knowledge, because the theory of knowledge that I was taught by Herbert Feigl, and that was popular at that time, was called logical positivism. Logical positivism looked at knowledge as something that came from experimentation and observation, and once a new law was discovered, it would be good forever. That didn't seem to make sense knowing what I knew about sciences, where the ideas are constantly evolving. And maybe it was my training in biology that led me to believe knowledge is not a constant thing, but instead it's evolving. I had some friendly arguments with Professor Feigl, but of course, he, being a world-class scholar, he always won the arguments. And again, my dad's teaching that if something doesn't make sense, better look for something else. And so I cast about, and my students cast about, for a better theory of knowledge. We found that in the 1960s, with Thomas Kuhn's work. Thomas Kuhn was a student of James Conant, and I had read Conant's On Understanding Science in 1949, and his ideas made a lot of sense, that science is a set of ideas or conceptual ideas that people develop, and they keep evolving. About the same time, we discovered David Ausubel's Educational Psychology, a cognitive view. And those two books really changed entirely the foundations for our research program. We were now going to use a constructivist view of knowledge creation and a cognitive psychology, not a behavioral psychology. And that was the tremendous turning point in our program. One of the people that really helped put these ideas together was Stephen Toulmin's book, Human Understanding, a cognitive view, and a focus on the creation of concepts. I guess part of what attracted me to his work was he talked about concepts being like species, evolving over time and changing, modifying, and sometimes becoming extinct, like, say, the idea of phlogiston in chemistry. Perhaps it was the biologist in me that was attracted to Toulmin's writings, but he was really a brilliant scholar, and I found him also to be a very warm person. We had several opportunities to meet and talk one-on-one. David Ausubel's book, Educational Psychology, a Cognitive View, was the first major educational psychology book that presented a cognitive theory of human learning, not a behavioral theory. And in 1968, it was revolutionary. In fact, so much so that a lot of his work was condemned by the profession, and he had a hard time getting some of his research papers published. Of course, all that changed in the 1980s, but that story will come later. David asked me, as we became acquainted, if I would help revise his 1968 book to produce a new edition, Educational Psychology, a Cognitive View. This book was not only an opportunity to work with Ausable, but to rethink some of his ideas. And part of what I debated with Ausable was the notion that rote learning, which is sometimes called just plain memorization, and meaningful learning, which leads to understanding concepts, were very distinct things, but I argued that there was a continuum, not a dichotomy between rote learning and meaningful learning. So I presented this as a continuum where rote learning was when an individual was committed to just memorizing whatever it is they were given to learn, whereas in meaningful learning, you try to say, well, how does this fit into what I already know? How can I change my conceptual understanding of the topic? And that's something that requires the learner to change from just rote memorizing to trying to understand. And it's an emotional commitment as well as a cognitive commitment. I saw high levels of meaningful learning as leading to creativity, an idea Ausable never accepted. But he did accept later in his work the notion that indeed learning can vary from pure rote, just pure memorizing without any effort to understand, to highly meaningful learning of the kind that takes place in laboratories, or when an author is creating a new novel, or a composer is composing a new song or a new symphony. Meaningful learning is a profoundly important concept, and I still find at this stage in my life that I'm getting new insights into the meaning of meaningful learning. So don't brush it off as, oh, that's just the opposite of rote learning. No, it's much more than that. And it's important to try to understand all that goes on when an individual is trying to reorganize their thinking to create new understandings. Our brain is a tremendously complicated organ, and it stores the things we learn. It stores concepts which we define as perceived regularities or patterns in objects or events designated by a symbol. So water is this stuff we can splash around in, and one begins to see that water can take many forms, but water is always water. And once you understand that, you have a concept of water. Of course, it could go on and understand that water is composed of oxygen and hydrogen, and so the meaning is extended. Propositions are when concepts are connected together to make a statement. Like water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. That's a proposition. All knowledge is really concepts and propositions. And if we want to understand any domain of knowledge, we have to understand the key concepts and the key propositions in that knowledge. One of the things I learned from our three children was the remarkable power of young children to acquire new concepts and new propositions. Nobody has to teach a young child how to acquire the language. They do it by themselves. The most difficult thing anyone will ever have to do in their life is to learn the language. And children do this automatically by age 3. I have a 3-year-old great-granddaughter, and it's just been marvelous watching her develop her capability to speak English and to understand English. So much of the psychology that I was learning as a graduate student just didn't match up what my children were teaching me. That given encouragement and love and caring, they could learn anything, virtually anything. and can understand what they were learning. So when Piaget's work was brought to my attention, not until after I graduated from the university, I was very skeptical of his notion that children develop reasoning power in stages, and they couldn't do abstract reasoning until ages 14 or 15. That sounded like more nonsense to me. And again, in spite of the fact that virtually every educator in the United States and many across the world totally subscribe to Piaget's work, not Ausubel's work, I argued they are wrong. That given the right instruction, young children can begin to understand science, they can understand important concepts in science, important concepts in math or in history or in anything else. And the determination to go forward in spite of all the opposition really was rooted in the confidence my dad built in me to say, Joe, you can do it. Just go ahead. So in a somewhat bullheaded fashion, I and my graduate students went ahead with our Ausubelian psychology and our cognitive philosophy of knowledge that is now called constructivist views of knowledge. I have developed a teaching tool called audio tutorial teaching while I was at Purdue University with Sam Postlewaite. Sam was a really gifted botany teacher, and he was always looking for better ways to teach botany. And I persuaded him to try to move away from lectures and laboratories to integrating the experience a child would have, or a college student in his case, studying materials while being guided through that study with audio tape. And we call this technique audio tutorial teaching. I later adapted this for teaching children ages 6 to 8 concepts of biology, concepts of physics and chemistry. And here we see a second grade child with our audio tutorial lesson on the particulate nature of matter, the fact that air is made of little particles, and you can blow them right through a piece of cloth or a piece of twine or anything that was porous, but you couldn't blow it through a piece of plastic that didn't allow the molecules to pass through. And it was about this time, working with the children, that I began to fashion a theory of education that held that knowledge is something humans create and evolve over time, that learning is the acquisition of conceptual understanding and propositional understanding, and that all of this can be combined into a theory of education that says education must focus on helping students become meaningful learners of concepts and propositions. At the time, most of my colleagues thought our research group was somewhere out in left field, but it was persuasive enough that I had many visiting professors and relatively large numbers of graduate students join my group and work with me. In 1977, we published the first attempt to present a theory of education, and I was then at Cornell University, and Cornell University was my publisher. The book was subsequently translated into 4 other languages, and there was some reception to the idea around the world, but a lot of skepticism, since in 1977, I was still by far the outsider in thinking about psychology of learning and the nature of knowledge as the creation of concepts and creation of new propositions. I also argue in the book that the thing that's wrong with education is not just that the curriculum is dated or something is obsolete, But there's just too much rote learning going on. I felt in my school education, both in elementary school and in high school, that all the teachers wanted me to do was memorize things. And I thought that was a waste of time. I wanted to understand things. And so that meant that my elementary and high school transcripts are full of C's, but very few A's. There were no D's or F's, though, because my commitment to trying to understand always carried me through at least to a C level on the exams. In the 1970s, most of the research done in science education was supported by the National Science Foundation. But none of my research proposals were funded by the National Science Foundation because most of the people on the review boards and indeed the directors of science education program itself thought that our theoretical foundations were not correct and the kinds of ideas we were trying to develop were not the appropriate ideas for teaching science. So that bias meant that I had to search elsewhere for funding. And fortunately, I had funding from the university through Hatch Act funding and from Shell Company's foundation that had first funded summer programs for teachers at Cornell. And then when we closed those down, they funded my research program to a limited extent. So in spite of the fact that we couldn't get any federal dollars from NSF, our program did go forward. We also published in 1972 another edition of audio tutorial teaching, and this became more popular around the world with many colleges adopting audio tutorial methods for teaching. As I indicated earlier, I developed this tool for teaching young children science concepts across the board, from how do plants grow to what is the nature of matter and energy. Here you see a first grade child looking at some seeds that they will be growing in a window box, and in the background is a cassette recorder that is guiding that child. We also use loop films on a Kodak loop film projector that was essentially new equipment at that time. We found that a 20-minute lesson could be done by a child, and we designed the lesson so when the child finished, the materials would be ready for the next child to study. So children could do the audio tutorial lessons entirely without teacher intervention. And this meant that we could add this to the elementary school program without interfering with their reading program or the arithmetic program. And it was quite popular in the schools where we worked. Once the children studied, the question was, how do we show that they are learning the concepts? We tried different forms of paper and pencil tests. None of those worked. The reasons the child was choosing answers had nothing to do with the ideas that we were trying to teach them. So we went to interviewing, and here you see a 6-year-old child being interviewed by one of my best graduate students, Richard Rowell. And we interviewed the students every 6 or 8 weeks to see how they were progressing. We began to have large numbers of these interviews, and the problem was, how do you make sense out of a typed transcript of an interview? The breakthrough came when we decided we could represent the information in that interview with a map showing concepts and relationships between concepts. And we called this thing a concept map. So in the 1970s, early 1970s, a research group developed this tool we now call the concept map, and then much later, here at the Institute, Alberto Cañas and his colleague developed software to make concept maps. easily and more precisely. And here you see an example of one of those concept maps made with CmapTools, and more about this as we go on.